Avoidant attachment structures tend to process emotional pain in a very different way compared to secure or anxious attachment styles. And this difference becomes especially visible after betrayal. When an avoidant person experiences betrayal, their nervous system does not naturally move toward emotional engagement, confrontation, or repair. Instead, it activates a strong internal defense mechanism that prioritizes emotional distance over emotional processing. This is not a conscious decision in most cases. It is a learned survival strategy developed over time, often rooted in early experiences where emotional expression was met with rejection, inconsistency, or overwhelm. Because of this conditioning, the moment betrayal occurs, the avoidant mind quickly categorizes the situation as unsafe for emotional exposure. Rather than sitting with the pain or attempting to understand it through dialogue, they begin to shut down access to vulnerable emotions. This shutdown does not mean they are unaffected. It means the feelings are being pushed out of awareness and stored in a compartmentalized mental space that is deliberately disconnected from conscious reflection. On the surface, this can look like calmness, indifference, or even emotional strength, but internally it is a form of freezing. The emotional system is still activated, but it is not being processed in a healthy, integrated way. As a result, instead of working through betrayal step by step, acknowledging hurt, expressing anger, seeking clarity, or negotiating repair, the avoidant psyche skips directly to detachment. They may reduce communication, withdraw attention, or emotionally disconnect from the relationship as a way of restoring internal control. This creates a false sense of resolution because the external behavior suggests they have moved on, while internally the emotional material remains unprocessed. Over time, this suppression leads to delayed emotional consequences, such as sudden waves of sadness, unexplained resentment, or internal confusion about what they actually feel. However, even these delayed emotions are rarely fully integrated because the avoidant system continues to block deep emotional engagement as a protective reflex. This is why betrayal does not lead to clean recovery for them. It leads to emotional fragmentation, where pieces of the experience are separated rather than understood as a whole. The more intense the betrayal, the stronger this defensive withdrawal becomes, reinforcing a cycle where avoidance replaces healing. When an avoidant experiences betrayal, their instinct is not to engage in emotional confrontation or open processing, but to activate a powerful defense mechanism centered around suppression and withdrawal. This response is deeply tied to how avoidant attachment forms in the first place. Over time, many avoidant individuals learn that emotional exposure leads to discomfort, loss of autonomy, or even emotional invalidation. As a result, they develop an internal rule. The safest way to deal with emotional threat is to minimize dependency and reduce emotional visibility. So when betrayal occurs, instead of moving toward the person to understand what happened, they move away from both the situation and their own emotional experience of it. This detachment is not simply physical distance, but psychological disengagement. The avoidant mind begins to downregulate emotional intensity by suppressing thoughts, numbing feelings, and redirecting attention towards self-sufficiency or external distractions. They may appear composed, logical, or unaffected, but this outward calm is often the result of emotional compartmentalization rather than genuine resolution. The pain is still present, but it is sealed off from conscious awareness in order to maintain a sense of control. What makes this pattern particularly complex is that suppression gives the illusion of strength. From the outside, it may seem like the avoidant is handling betrayal well because they are not visibly emotional or reactive. However, internally, nothing is being resolved. The emotional experience is not processed through communication, reflection, or vulnerability. It is simply pushed aside. This is why avoidants rarely seek closure in the traditional sense after betrayal. Closure would require emotional exposure, and emotional exposure feels risky to their nervous system. Instead of confronting the betrayal, they often rebuild psychological distance by redefining the relationship in their mind as something they no longer need. This cognitive reframing helps them justify withdrawal, making it easier to disconnect without feeling overwhelmed by grief or anger. However, this strategy comes at a cost. Because the emotional material is not integrated, it does not disappear. It lingers beneath the surface. Over time, suppressed emotions can resurface indirectly, often in the form of irritability, emotional numbness, or sudden rejection of reminders connected to the relationship. But even then, the avoidant typically avoids fully engaging with the emotional root. This ongoing cycle of suppression and detachment creates a loop where betrayal is never truly processed, only distanced from, leaving recovery incomplete and emotionally fragmented. Avoidant individuals often struggle with something deeper than simple emotional avoidance after betrayal, and that is emotional integration. Emotional integration is the psychological ability to hold multiple emotional truths at the same time and combine them into a coherent understanding of an experience. In healthy processing, a person can feel love and hurt simultaneously, recognize trust and disappointment together, and still build meaning from both. However, for avoidance, this blending of emotional states becomes extremely difficult because their internal system is structured around separation rather than synthesis. When betrayal occurs, the avoidant mind does not naturally merge the positive and negative aspects of the relationship into a unified emotional narrative. Instead, it splits them apart. Love, trust, attachment, and safety are placed in one mental category, while pain, betrayal, and vulnerability are placed in another. These categories remain disconnected, making it difficult for the person to fully understand what the relationship actually meant to them in a balanced way. As a result, their emotional response often appears inconsistent or confusing, both to themselves and to others. This fragmentation leads to emotional numbness in some moments and sudden emotional intensity in others. Because the feelings are not integrated, they do not flow in a steady, processed way. Instead, they surface in isolated fragments. One moment, the avoidant may feel completely detached, convincing themselves that the relationship no longer matters. In another moment, a memory or trigger may activate unresolved emotional pain, causing unexpected discomfort or inner tension. But even when these emotions surface, the avoidant mind quickly pushes them back into separation, rather than allowing them to merge into understanding. This inability to integrate emotional experiences also affects their decision-making after betrayal. Since they cannot easily combine love and hurt into a single, complex truth, they tend to simplify the situation. The mind may conclude either, "This relationship was unsafe," or "I shouldn't feel anything at all," rather than holding the nuanced reality that someone can be both loved and a source of pain. This simplification is a protective mechanism, but it prevents emotional closure. Without integration, there is no clear emotional resolution. The experience remains fragmented in memory, and the avoidant may struggle to fully articulate what they feel, even long after the betrayal has occurred. This is why they often appear emotionally distant or detached from relationships that once mattered deeply. Internally, the pieces of experience exist, but they are never fully assembled into a complete emotional understanding, leaving the healing process incomplete and disjointed. Even when an avoidant still has genuine emotional attachment to the person who betrayed them, their nervous system often overrides that attachment with a stronger survival-based response: emotional threat detection. For avoidant individuals, closeness is already something that sits in a delicate balance between desire and discomfort. They can feel deeply connected to someone, yet simultaneously feel overwhelmed when emotional intensity rises. Betrayal disrupts this fragile balance in a very powerful way because it combines attachment with perceived danger, creating an internal conflict that the avoidant system is not designed to tolerate for long. When betrayal is experienced, the nervous system does not process it as a simple relational mistake or misunderstanding. Instead, it encodes it as a violation of emotional safety and personal control. This is crucial because avoidants are highly sensitive to situations where they feel emotionally exposed, dependent, or unable to regulate distance. Betrayal activates all of these sensitivities at once. As a result, even if love still exists internally, the body begins to associate the relationship itself with instability and risk. This creates a psychological split where emotional attachment continues to exist, but access to it becomes restricted. The avoidant person may still think about the partner, still feel longing in quiet moments, or still experience emotional memory flashes, but these experiences are filtered through a strong protective layer of detachment. The nervous system essentially prioritizes self-protection over connection. So instead of moving toward repair or reconnection, the system chooses distance as a way to reduce internal stress. What makes this even more complex is that the avoidant mind often interprets emotional safety as control over availability. When betrayal occurs, that sense of control is broken. Even if the partner did not intend harm in a way that justifies permanent separation, the avoidant nervous system still records the experience as unpredictability in attachment. And unpredictability is deeply uncomfortable for avoidant structures because it forces emotional reliance on something that feels unstable. This is why reconnection becomes psychologically unsafe, even when emotional bonds remain active. The body remembers the emotional disruption more strongly than the mind remembers affection. So the avoidant may resist returning not because feelings are gone, but because returning would require re-entering a state where emotional safety feels uncertain again. In this way, attachment does not disappear after betrayal. It becomes inaccessible, locked behind a protective response that prioritizes emotional control over emotional reunion. After betrayal, avoidant individuals often do not move through a clean emotional healing process. Instead, they become caught in what can be described as avoidance loops. These loops are internal cycles where conflicting emotional impulses continuously cancel each other out, preventing real resolution. On one side of the loop, there is an underlying attachment bond that still exists. This bond can show up as memories, emotional flashbacks, curiosity about the other person, or even subtle longing that surfaces in quiet moments. On the other side, there is a strong defensive system that pushes toward detachment, rationalization, and emotional distancing. These two forces do not integrate. Instead, they alternate. At one moment, the avoidant may feel a sudden emotional pull toward the person who betrayed them. This could be triggered by loneliness, familiarity, or unresolved emotional memory. In that moment, the attachment system becomes briefly active, and the mind may start to reevaluate the relationship or imagine reconnection. However, this activation quickly triggers discomfort because closeness is associated with vulnerability and loss of control. As soon as emotional intensity rises, the avoidant defense system intervenes, shutting down the emotional opening and reinforcing distance again. This back and forth creates a cycle where emotional progress is constantly interrupted. Instead of moving forward into processing grief, understanding betrayal, or integrating the experience, the avoidant becomes stuck between feeling and avoiding. Each time emotion rises, avoidance suppresses it. Each time distance becomes too strong, attachment briefly resurfaces. But neither state is allowed to fully develop into resolution. Over time, this loop prevents closure. Closure requires sustained emotional engagement, where feelings are acknowledged, expressed, and gradually integrated into a coherent understanding of what happened. Avoidants, however, rarely stay in emotional engagement long enough for this to occur. The nervous system is trained to interrupt vulnerability before it becomes overwhelming. As a result, the emotional wound remains active but unprocessed. This internal conflict can also create confusion in behavior. From the outside, the avoidant may seem inconsistent, sometimes distant, sometimes reflective, sometimes suddenly indifferent, and at other times quietly affected. But internally, these shifts are not signs of healing. They are signs of the loop cycling between attachment activation and defensive withdrawal. Because neither side of the loop wins, emotional resolution is delayed indefinitely. The person does not fully reconnect with the relationship, but they also do not fully release it. Instead, they exist in a suspended emotional state where the betrayal is never completely processed, only revisited and suppressed repeatedly, keeping the wound psychologically open over time. Ultimately, what looks like healing in avoidant individuals after betrayal is often not emotional recovery in the traditional sense, but a deeper psychological restructuring designed to restore internal safety. Instead of processing pain through reflection, communication, and emotional integration, the avoidance system prioritizes reducing emotional exposure altogether. This leads to a process that can be described as emotional shutdown, where the goal is not to resolve feelings, but to minimize their activation. After betrayal, the mind begins to reorganize the relationship in a way that decreases its emotional significance. This does not happen through acceptance or closure, but through distancing and reclassification. The person who was once emotionally central is gradually repositioned as less relevant, less accessible, or even mentally filed away in a category that no longer requires emotional engagement. On the surface, this can appear as strength or independence, but internally it is a protective adaptation designed to prevent further emotional injury. This reorganization is not linear, and it does not follow the stages of grief that involve active processing. Instead, it functions more like emotional compartmentalization. The avoidant mind separates the emotional memory of the relationship from present awareness. The feelings associated with the betrayal are not fully resolved. They are simply pushed into a less accessible part of the psyche. This allows daily functioning to continue without the constant pressure of unresolved emotional pain. However, this form of healing comes at a cost. Because emotional proximity is erased rather than integrated, the experience remains incomplete at a deeper level. The person may no longer actively think about the betrayal, but the emotional imprint is not fully metabolized. It is stored in a dormant state rather than transformed into understanding. This is why avoidance can appear unaffected while still carrying unresolved emotional residues internally. Over time, this protective shutdown can also influence how they approach future relationships. Since betrayal has been linked with emotional danger, the nervous system becomes more cautious about forming deep attachment again. Emotional walls may become higher, trust may take longer to develop, and vulnerability may feel increasingly risky. This reinforces the cycle of avoidance as a long-term strategy rather than a temporary response. In this sense, avoidants do not truly recover after betrayal in a clean emotional arc. Instead, they adapt by reducing emotional access, reorganizing attachment internally, and prioritizing psychological safety over emotional completion. The result is a state that looks like healing from the outside, but internally is closer to controlled emotional disengagement that preserves distance rather than restoring full relational integration.